Did you know that the version of the Old Testament the earliest writers of the New Testament sourced from is different than the Old Testament in many Protestant Bibles today? Dun, dun, dun! So quick history. After the Babylonian exile ended in 538 BC, there was a desperate need for the Hebrew people to recapture their identity. Entire generations of Hebraic children and adults were returning from exile in a strange land under strange gods. They needed to reinstate cultural traditions and centralize their religion to reestablish both politically and religiously who they were. And tradition states that the men who led that charge were Ezra and the scribes, also called the Great Assembly, a group of 120 scribes, wise men, and prophets, in the period from the end of the biblical prophets in 516 BC to the early Greek period 150, 200 years later. And among their achievements were the fixing a Hebrew biblical canon, introducing the Feast of Purim, the Amida prayer, as well as the temple prayers, rituals, and benedictions. And by the 5th century BC, the Torah was accepted as canon. By the 3rd century BC, the narrative histories and writings of the prophets were codified. And by the 2nd century BC, most, but not all, of the writings, like Psalms, Proverbs, additional histories, etc., were formalized, most written in what is called Biblical Hebrew and some Aramaic, creating the Tanakh. But a big problem was that by the late 3rd century BC, very few people spoke Biblical Hebrew outside of learned communities. Aramaic was in use in Judea, but as Hellenism spread throughout the Mediterranean, outside of Judea, the most common language was Greek. And the Jewish upper classes, such as the Sadducees, became deeply Hellenized. And as ancient Israel became increasingly Hellenized due to the spread of Greek philosophy and thought, there was a desire to see these Hebrew scriptures translated into Greek, creating what's now referred to as the Greek Old Testament, or the Septuagint, which means translation of the 70. Story goes that at the request of Pharaoh Ptolemy the Great, some versions say Ptolemy II, 70 Jewish scholars, or 72 depending on what tradition you ascribe to, 6 scholars each from the 12 tribes of Israel, independently produced a Greek translation of the Hebrew Torah, and miraculously, each grouping presented identical divinely inspired translations. Now, whether that legend is true or not, evidence proves that Greek translations of the Torah were circulating by the 3rd century BC, with the remaining books of the Tanakh translated into Greek during the 2nd century. But regardless of who commissioned it, who translated it, the absolute facts are that soon the Greek version of Hebrew scriptures were in wider use than the Hebrew. Why? Most people didn't understand biblical Hebrew. So in Israeli temples, speakers would read some scrolls in Hebrew and they would translate to the common language of Aramaic. But outside of formal setting, and always among Greek speakers, it was the Septuagint that was commonly used. Additionally, the Septuagint version of the Old Testament is quoted more by New Testament authors, particularly the Pauline epistles and the Apostolic Fathers. Have you ever wondered why in some of your Bible's New Testament verses, like Acts 7, 52, 53, Hebrews 2, 1 through 2, and Galatians 3:19, they describe the Mosaic Law as actually given by angels? Yet there's no reference to that in the Old Testament. But it's not because the New Testament writers were making stuff up. It's because the writers of those verses are quoting the Septuagint version of the text. In fact, some scholars estimate the 27 books of the Greek New Testament, most of the 320 direct quotations, and the combined total of possibly 890 quotations and references to the Old Testament Hebrew scriptures are based on the Septuagint. And the Septuagint included more books than the Hebrew Bible, which is the source of the Apocrypha. So during the early church's day, it was the Greek Septuagint version of the Old Testament that people were familiar with and formed much of the thought for early writers of the New Testament, as well as the church fathers, and also formed the earliest translations that we currently have, the Codices Alexandrinus, Sinaiticus, and Vaticanus. And this is further demonstrated by the recent discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which includes our earliest and oldest surviving manuscripts of entire books later included in the biblical canon, along with deuterocanonical and extra-biblical manuscripts, which preserve evidence of the diversity of religious thought in late Second Temple Judaism. So it is a fact that the earliest Greek and Latin translations of what would eventually become the New Testament are based upon the Septuagint. And yes, there are a few differences. But what does all that mean? Should we throw away our Bibles that aren't based on the Septuagint translation of the Old Testament? Absolutely not. That's just silly. The main thing is still the main thing. But there are some interesting differences and reasons why later rabbis would want to move away from the Septuagint and create what would be called the Masoretic texts, which form the base of many Protestant Bibles today. But that's another video for another time. But at the least, the Septuagint offers us a fascinating glimpse into the minds of the early writers of the New Testament. And if you're interested in reading the Old Testament the writers of the New Testament had in mind, you should pick yourself up a copy of the Septuagint. And if you're curious, here's some versions that I own, and you can find links in my profile. The history of the Bible is crazier than any silly conspiracy theory out there. And click on the pinned videos for more.